Let's talk about something that most people miss when analyzing global power: the psychological game of diplomacy. See, what happened recently between India and Pakistan wasn't just a headline moment. It was a masterclass in strategic timing, narrative control, and diplomatic dominance. Most people are focused on weapons and borders, but the real war is in perception. And in this game, India just outplayed both Pakistan and, unexpectedly, even America. Now let's break it down clearly. Pakistan has long relied on global sympathy, playing the victim card on Kashmir, appealing to Western guilt, using international forums to paint India as the aggressor. This strategy worked for decades. They had their usual talking points, their diplomatic alliances, and, let's be honest, the quiet nods from Washington and London. But India decided enough was enough, and what they did wasn't loud, it wasn't aggressive, it was surgical. At a major global summit, the kind where cameras are always rolling and every word becomes tomorrow's headline, India flipped the script. They didn't attack Pakistan directly. Instead, they exposed the hypocrisy calmly, factually, and with absolute precision. They laid out Pakistan's track record on terrorism, on human rights violations, on economic instability, but they did it with calm confidence, not anger. That's important. The world respects maturity, not noise. India's diplomats, backed by meticulous data, real stories, and even testimonies from ex-insiders, made their case. And the beauty is, they didn't shout. They didn't beg. They let the truth speak. And when truth is spoken with clarity, it becomes impossible to ignore, even for America. You have to understand how rare this is. For decades, the global South has been told what to think, how to act. Diplomacy was a Western sport. India refused to play that game. They brought their own rules. They showed the world that being powerful doesn't mean being aggressive. It means being clear, consistent, and confident. This is why Pakistan was humiliated. Not just because India made a better argument, but because Pakistan wasn't prepared for an India that didn't react emotionally. They were waiting for anger. They got strategy, and that's much more terrifying. And here's where America got uncomfortable. For years, the US liked having its thumb on the scale. They benefited from managing the India-Pakistan rivalry. But in that moment, the US wasn't the center. India didn't look west for validation. They didn't seek approval. They moved with the quiet confidence of a nation that knows its value. That's what America couldn't handle. The realization that they're no longer the director of this geopolitical play. Let me put it another way. In business, the most powerful companies don't waste time trash-talking competitors. They deliver results and let the market speak. India is now doing the same thing on the world stage. They're not interested in emotional outbursts. They're focused on impact. And psychologically, this is profound. Because power isn't about who speaks the loudest. It's about who sets the tone. Who frames the story? India framed the narrative, Pakistan followed, and America realized, too late, that they weren't leading anymore. This is what Jack Ma always talks about. When you have clarity of vision, you don't chase validation. You act with purpose, and the world eventually catches up. That's exactly what India did, and in doing so, they taught an important lesson not just to Pakistan, not just to America, but to every emerging nation that's tired of playing second fiddle. What India showed is that strategy beats noise, clarity beats drama, and self-belief, real unshakable confidence, is the most powerful diplomatic weapon there is. So now the question is, who's next? Which country will have the courage to step out of the shadow of old powers and claim its space with dignity, not desperation? Now let's talk about strength. Not just physical strength, but the kind of strategic strength that rewrites relationships between nations. Because when India displayed its military capabilities recently, it wasn't just about showing off hardware. It was a calculated message. A message directed at two very different audiences. One, Pakistan, which still believes that old threats can work. And two, America, which suddenly realized that India is no longer waiting for validation. It's building deterrence on its own terms. Let's be clear. Pakistan's military posturing has always relied on theatrics, short-range missiles, loud declarations, and a reputation that's been more myth than reality. For years, they've leaned on the idea that being unpredictable gave them leverage. But unpredictability only works when the other side is unsure. That era is over. India isn't unsure anymore. In fact, India is so sure of itself now that it doesn't need to react emotionally. It simply demonstrates capability. Think about it. When India revealed its advancements in next-gen drone technology, smart artillery, cyber warfare integration, and satellite-guided precision strikes, they weren't looking to provoke. They were showing calm, composed preparedness. It was a psychological shift, because real power doesn't scream, it whispers. And that whisper was loud enough to shake the core of Pakistan's military confidence. Here's the deeper truth most analysts miss. Military superiority is not about the size of your arsenal. It's about perception. When your opponent believes they can no longer surprise you, when they know every scenario has been prepared for, that's when fear sets in. Pakistan isn't afraid of India's weapons. It's afraid of India's discipline, its silence, its planning, its quiet readiness. And here's where things get interesting for America. See, for decades, the U.S. has been the unspoken referee in South Asia's military dynamics. Their defense sales, intelligence sharing, and subtle interventions kept them relevant. But now, India's growing independence in defense manufacturing, from Tejas to Agniveer, from IN to cutting-edge drone swarms, has changed the rules. India isn't asking for technology anymore. It's building it. Better yet, it's exporting it. This independence makes America nervous. Why? Because it threatens their control. A self-reliant India with robust military capability doesn't just checkmate Pakistan. It rewires the entire regional equation. And Washington isn't used to not being the one pulling strings. But here's what makes India's rise so unique, and this is something most powerful countries still don't understand. India isn't interested in flexing for dominance. It's flexing for security, for stability, for respect. This isn't a military hungry to conquer. This is a military designed to protect, to deter, to ensure that no nation, not even a nuclear-armed one, dares to gamble recklessly. The psychology here is profound. India is showing that discipline is more terrifying than aggression. Preparation is more effective than provocation. And perhaps most importantly, restraint is more powerful than reaction. That restraint is what humiliates Pakistan, because it reveals the truth. You cannot intimidate someone who no longer needs to prove themselves. India doesn't flinch anymore. And in geopolitics, when one player refuses to react, the game changes entirely. You can see it in the way India conducts its border operations. Quietly efficient, data-driven, minimal public noise. You can see it in its defense exports, growing influence in the Indo-Pacific, its joint drills with countries like France, Japan, Australia. India isn't trying to be noticed, it's building partnerships while Pakistan builds excuses. And for America, the shock isn't just that India has risen. It's that India has done it without them. This is the first time in decades where a regional superpower has emerged, not as a client state, not as a dependent ally, but as a sovereign equal. That reality is difficult for Washington to digest, because the old model of power, where military influence could be traded like currency, doesn't work anymore. India has proven that military dominance today isn't about war, it's about deterrence through dignity. It's about building a force so effective, so resilient, that even the thought of conflict becomes irrational for your enemy. And maybe that's the message for all of us. In a world obsessed with reaction, those who stay prepared, stay calm, and stay focused will always win, not because they seek war, but because they make war impossible. Now let's shift our focus to the battlefield that isn't lined with tanks or missiles, the economic front. If you truly want to humiliate a nation, you don't fight them on the borders, you choke the cash flow. You isolate them in trade. You block the bridges they depend on. And that's exactly what India did to Pakistan. Quietly, calculatedly, and in a way that even America had to take seriously. For years, Pakistan has operated under the illusion that it could keep provoking India while still benefiting from the global financial system. It played both sides, asking for aid from the West, securing loans from China, and meanwhile allowing instability to fester in the region. It believed it could survive on external dependency while threatening a neighbor that was growing more self-reliant by the day. But what happened recently? India struck where it hurt the most: trade, investment, access to markets. With a few deliberate moves, India tightened export-import policies, rerouted strategic projects, and used its influence to freeze or delay international funding that Pakistan desperately needed. No speeches, no military parades, just quiet economic isolation. And the world watched. Let's be honest, in today's world, it's not the tanks that bring a nation to its knees, saving countries. Let's not dump our brothers and sisters that make it needed. It's the lack of dollars. It's the credit downgrades. It's the crumbling foreign reserves. And that's where India's strategy was genius. While Pakistan was busy shouting in global forums, India was working behind the scenes, strengthening trade alliances with ASEAN, the Gulf, the EU, and the African Union. It was building corridors that didn't involve Pakistan. It was investing in new maritime routes, new supply chains, new technology partnerships. The world started aligning with India, not just politically, but economically. And this is where America started to feel uncomfortable. Because, let's be clear, the US financial system has long been the invisible hand behind who succeeds and who struggles. Aid, sanctions, dollar reserves, IMF pressure, these were all tools the US used to manage influence. But when India began leveraging its own economic weight to reshape South Asia, without Washington's consultation, it disrupted the existing playbook. India didn't wait for approval. It used its $3 trillion, $500 billion zero-cents economy, its massive consumer base, its credibility in global institutions, and started rerouting opportunity away from Pakistan. It was as if a light switch flipped. Suddenly, Pakistan wasn't just isolated politically, it became irrelevant economically. And that, more than anything, was the real humiliation. Because here's the truth that's hard to admit. No country respects a beggar. And Pakistan, at this point, has built an economic strategy around survival, not strength. Loans from the IMF, bailouts from China, conditional support from Saudi Arabia. These are not signs of sovereignty, they're signs of dependency. And in the modern world, dependency is the worst kind of weakness. India, on the other hand, is walking the exact opposite path. It's not just making money, it's designing systems. UPI is revolutionizing digital payments. Startups are scaling globally. Indian brands are becoming global players in pharmaceuticals, tech, and renewable energy. Even countries that once ignored India are now seeking partnerships. Why? Because India is not selling desperation, it's selling value. And this contrast between a Pakistan begging for survival and an India offering innovation is what forced the world to make a choice. And increasingly, they are choosing India. Not because of sentiment, but because of logic. This is where psychological insight matters. When you build quietly, when you become useful to others, when you focus on adding value instead of chasing validation, you become magnetic. Others want to work with you not because you demand it, but because they benefit from it. That's how India is playing the economic game. And that's why Pakistan and even America are rattled. America isn't afraid of India's military or even its diplomacy. It's afraid of losing economic control. And when India shows that it can realign regional trade, create new financial ecosystems, and lock Pakistan out of major deals, all without American oversight, it sends a dangerous signal that the world no longer needs Washington's permission to prosper. That's the shift. That's the power. That's the humiliation. Because what Pakistan is feeling right now isn't just economic pain, it's strategic irrelevance. And what America is realizing is that India is no longer a partner in need. It's a competitor with vision. And the most important lesson here? In a world that rewards innovation over noise, the loudest one in the room is rarely the one in control. True strength isn't declared, it's demonstrated. Quietly, systematically, unapologetically. Let's talk about what really hurts a country more than sanctions, more than military losses, more than even economic isolation. Global embarrassment. Because when the world stops taking you seriously, when your credibility collapses in front of cameras, when your lies are exposed not by your enemy, but by your own contradictions, that's when the humiliation becomes permanent. That's exactly what happened to Pakistan. And the way India handled it was nothing short of brilliant. We live in a world where narratives matter more than facts. Whoever controls the story controls perception. And perception in today's world is power. Pakistan, for decades, has relied on telling the same story at every international platform, that it is a victim, that Kashmir is under siege, that terrorism is a reaction to injustice, that India is the aggressor. This narrative used to get them attention, it used to get them sympathy, and more importantly, it gave them cover. But here's the problem with relying on a false narrative for too long. The moment someone shines a spotlight on it, it falls apart. And that's exactly what India did. But not in anger, not with dramatic speeches. India showed evidence, dates, video, statements from Pakistan's own former diplomats, generals, even their own journalists. At one key international forum, whether the UN or G20 or another high-profile summit, India calmly pulled back the curtain. They let the facts speak for themselves. And when that happened, the audience wasn't shocked by India's words, they were stunned by Pakistan's silence. See, when you live off victimhood long enough, you forget how to defend yourself with truth. And when India presented a case based not on emotion, but on logic, on timelines, on statistics, the world saw a version of Pakistan they weren't used to seeing, unprepared, unconvincing, and exposed. It wasn't just a diplomatic win. It was a psychological defeat for Pakistan. Even countries that were traditionally neutral or quietly sympathetic began to distance themselves. Leaders that once echoed Pakistan's concerns started speaking more cautiously. Journalists who used to recycle old talking points began asking harder questions. In the eyes of the world, something shifted. Pakistan was no longer seen as misunderstood. It was seen as manipulative. And no amount of denial could erase that shift. What's more fascinating is how India managed to pull this off without ever appearing aggressive. That's where the real brilliance lies. The tone wasn't angry, it was tired. Tired of repeating the same facts, tired of responding to the same accusations. That emotional shift from defense to indifference was incredibly powerful, because the world doesn't rally around those who beg. It respects those who no longer need to justify themselves. And that is exactly what rattled America. The United States has always played a balancing act between India and Pakistan. But suddenly, that balance was gone. One side looked like a mature, rising superpower. The other looked like a country still clinging to 20th century politics. America realized, maybe too late, that India no longer needed their validation, but Pakistan still did. And in the court of global opinion, that imbalance is devastating. This is what people don't understand about global embarrassment. It's irreversible. You can recover from economic losses. You can rebuild your military. But once your narrative collapses on the world stage, it becomes part of history. It becomes part of how people remember you. Pakistan's global credibility took decades to build, and India dismantled it in a few minutes, with clarity, with composure, and most importantly, with truth. There's something deeply psychological here that applies not just to nations, but to individuals too. If you rely on lies to build your identity, you live in constant fear of being found out. But when your foundation is truth, you can stand quietly while others collapse. That's what India demonstrated, and that's why Pakistan isn't just angry, it's afraid. Because the truth once revealed doesn't need repeating. And if there's one thing the world learned in that moment, it's that India doesn't need to prove its side anymore. It just needs to be heard once. After that, reality takes care of the rest. So ask yourself this: are you building your credibility on loud claims or quiet truths? Are you chasing sympathy or commanding respect? Because the world isn't moved by noise, it's moved by character. And character, once revealed, always rises above chaos. Let's get to the part of this whole equation that most people don't want to talk about openly: America's reaction. Because here's the truth: when India humiliated Pakistan, it didn't just shift power in South Asia. It shook the very foundation of how the United States has historically maintained control in the region. And the discomfort in Washington wasn't about sympathy for Pakistan. It was about losing control of the narrative, something far more valuable than territory or trade. For decades, the US played the role of the puppet master. It kept the India-Pakistan rivalry alive, not out of malice, but because it gave them leverage. As long as both sides looked to Washington for guidance, weapons, funding, or approval, America stayed at the center of the chessboard. They could sell arms to both, apply pressure when it suited them, and call themselves peace brokers while maintaining strategic control. But this time, India didn't play that game. It didn't wait for Washington to signal green lights. It didn't ask for permission. It moved independently, diplomatically, militarily, and economically. And the result was devastating for Pakistan. But more importantly, it revealed something far bigger. India no longer sees America as the referee. And that's what really rattled them. See, power isn't always about having the biggest military or the deepest pocket. It's about setting the terms. For a long time, America was the one defining what was acceptable, what was justified, what was in global interest. But suddenly, India flipped that script. It started defining its own terms, framing its own legitimacy, and acting with a kind of quiet confidence that didn't need outside approval. That shift, while subtle, was enormous. Imagine you're used to being the director of a movie, and suddenly the lead actor starts improvising, not just a few lines, but the whole story. That's how Washington saw this unfolding. They weren't in charge of the dialogue anymore. They weren't even consulted on the script. India was writing its own narrative, executing its own moves, and succeeding. And that success without dependence was the real humiliation for America. Pakistan's meltdown was expected, but America's silence, that told a deeper story. Because what could they say? Criticize India and risk alienating their most important Asian partner? Support India and admit their diminishing relevance? Either way, it was clear they were no longer needed in the conversation. This is where psychological depth becomes important. When a power that is used to control suddenly finds itself irrelevant, it doesn't always fight back. Sometimes it freezes, it watches, it recalibrates. That's what we're seeing right now with the United States. Behind closed doors, there's strategic confusion, because the old model where emerging nations looked westward for guidance no longer works. India has shown the world that it can manage its own neighborhood, it can outmaneuver its adversaries without being pushed from behind, it can build coalitions, enforce boundaries, and expose falsehoods on its own terms. That sends a message not just to Pakistan, but to the entire global order. India is no longer a regional player. It's a global force, and it acts like one. And let's be honest, that makes some people in Washington very, very nervous, because it's not just about South Asia. If India can independently reshape its regional dynamics, what's stopping Brazil or Indonesia or Nigeria from doing the same in their regions? What if more countries stop looking to old powers for validation? What if the world becomes multipolar, not just in theory, but in action? This is the larger shift we're living through, not just the humiliation of one country or the silence of another, but the slow, undeniable collapse of centralized power. The rise of confident, independent voices who aren't afraid to speak their own truths and act on them. And that's why what India did to Pakistan matters. Because in doing so, it exposed more than weakness, it exposed dependence. And dependence, whether it's in diplomacy, economics, or psychology, is the fastest way to fall behind in today's world. So here's the lesson. For nations, for leaders, and for each of us as individuals, the moment you stop asking for permission is the moment you start becoming powerful. You don't need to wait to be chosen. You need to choose yourself. And once you do that, the world will have no choice but to take notice. There's a moment in every nation's journey where the tone shifts from aspiration to assertion, from request to declaration. That moment for India is now. What we're witnessing is not just a geopolitical confrontation with Pakistan or a diplomatic rebuke to the West. It's something much deeper. India is stepping into its own identity, not just as a regional power, but as a confident, self-directed global player. And the most profound part, it's doing it without noise, without desperation, and without waiting for anyone's approval. For decades, India played the role others expected it to play: the cautious democracy, the spiritual economy, the rising power with humble restraint. But power without self-belief is like wealth without purpose. It doesn't lead, it hesitates. And the world used that hesitation, especially countries like the United States, to box India into a narrative where it was always rising but never quite arrived. That story is over. The recent series of moves, diplomatic, military, economic, and narrative-based, have revealed something undeniable. India has stopped asking for a seat at the table. It's building its own table. And more importantly, others are now lining up to sit with India, not just near it. The world taking deeper and deeper into India's private scares. The world taking deeper and deeper into India's private scares. The world taking deeper and deeper into India's private scares. And more importantly, others are now lining up to sit with India, not just near it. This is the psychological shift that changes everything. Let's reflect on the psychological transformation here. When a nation internalizes its own value, it stops negotiating from a place of fear. It stops reacting to threats. It starts creating opportunities. And when that shift happens, everything else realigns. Diplomacy becomes influence, defense becomes deterrence, trade becomes leverage, and humiliation turns into a tool, not a liability. Pakistan's fall in this context wasn't just a collapse of policy. It was the exposure of a mindset still trapped in old patterns, reactive, insecure, and dependent. India's rise, on the other hand, is the emergence of a mindset that has grown out of discipline, resilience, and vision. That's why India didn't respond to provocations with theatrics. It responded with structure, with results, and with silence. The kind that comes from deep, unshakable confidence. Now here's where the global implications come in. America, and much of the Western world, had grown used to managing global affairs like a CEO manages departments. Asia was a division, the Middle East another. And emerging powers like India were always part of the long-term growth plan, but never the boardroom. What rattles them now is that India didn't ask to be invited. It started its own boardroom, and it's already in session. That's why we're seeing discomfort, not just from Pakistan, but from Washington, London, Brussels, not because they dislike India's rise, but because they're realizing they're no longer needed to supervise it. And that's where this becomes more than geopolitics. This is about a mindset shift every individual, every entrepreneur, every emerging leader needs to understand. Because it's the exact same principle. You don't grow by trying to be liked by everyone. You grow by being so competent, so clear, and so necessary that the world has no choice but to respect you. India is showing the world what it looks like when a country moves with internal alignment. Its foreign policy is no longer fragmented. Its economy is being streamlined around innovation, infrastructure, and digital leadership. Its military posture is about capability, not performance. Its diplomacy is no longer about proving worth. It's about extending value. That's a rare kind of alignment, and it's incredibly difficult to stop once it begins. So when people say India just humiliated Pakistan and America can't handle it, the real meaning isn't just about a tactical win or a diplomatic upper hand. It's about the fact that India no longer defines itself in opposition to others. It defines itself through its own standards, its own strategies, its own story. And when a nation or a person reaches that level of self-definition, it becomes unstoppable. Not because it's louder, but because it's clearer. Not because it fights harder, but because it fights smarter. And not because it seeks confrontation, but because it has mastered the art of control. So here's what it all comes down to. Whether you're leading a country, a company, or your own life, real power begins the moment you stop performing for others and start living by your own principles. And once that happens, once you embrace that clarity, no one can humiliate you because your dignity is no longer for sale.